Hi. So this lecture is on interpreting argument text, and specifically what we're talking about is the setting. And before you go into this lecture, it would be a really good idea for you to make sure that you have read the chapter in your textbook on the setting. I don't expect necessarily that reading through it one time, especially one time quickly, you're going to necessarily go ding ding, I get everything. But if you read through it, then as you walk through, as we go through this lecture, hopefully some of those things that you were fuzzy on are going to start to click and make sense. And then if you go back and read it again after you watch the lecture, hopefully it'll really make sense and you'll really get it. I do want to say too that it would also make sure that you have read or done the discussion, the Vox article on guys and using the word guys. I'm going to be using that as an example when I go through here and talk about interpreting texts and understanding the idea of the setting of argument. So you should be pretty familiar with that by now because we've already had a discussion on it. But if for some reason or another you're not familiar with that, it would be a pretty good idea to familiarize yourself with that. So, all right. The setting. In your textbook, this is chapter 2. It is one of the most important and crucial aspects of argument, right? The setting does not refer to context, okay? Those two terms are not synonymous. Now, they are related to one another, all right? The context shape and influences the setting. All right, the setting is a product of the context, but so too are the reasons, so too are the claims, right? Like all aspects of argument, because all aspects of communication are contextual. But when we're talking about the setting, specifically what we're talking about are assumptions, all right? All arguers, indeed I would say all communicators, enter into communication situations with certain sets of assumptions. That's totally normal. That old adage, you know, when you make an assumption, you make an ASS out of you and me. Well, that really is, I guess I would say try not making assumptions, right? Like go through life or have a communication interaction with somebody where you make absolutely zero assumptions. Okay, but that said, we're specifically interested in the assumptions that arguers make about the world, right? Not every little thing, maybe in a way every little thing, but really, what are the assumptions that really have a bearing? Which assumptions are really relevant to the argument that we're having right here? And remember, assumptions are things that when I make an argument and I make an assumption, I'm usually operating under the assumption that you are also making that same assumption. These are what I take to be shared beliefs, things that are obvious, stuff I don't need to explain because everyone already pretty much gets it, right? So for example, what's real and not real, what's possible and impossible, what's good, what's right, what's just, what's fair, and then what are the opposites of those things, right? Now, these are things that we don't necessarily talk about. They're not necessarily things that are happening here at the level where we're speaking, but they're happening down here at the level where everybody knows, or it's safe to assume that everybody knows, right? Now, that doesn't mean true, and there's often a lot of kind of cagey stuff going on down there in the world of assumptions. But in argument, we don't pretend that those assumptions don't exist, right? They have an actual real impact on our argument. But most importantly, argumentation So when we make arguments, okay, we assume this world in which you can make truth claims, right? There are people who don't like argument because they don't like truth claims, right? Any kind of master narrative they find very threatening for some reason. That's fine, okay, and they're free to have that position. That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is that you can't say there's no world in which a truth claim is possible and then also make arguments in that world. Okay, there is no setting in a world that assumes you can't possibly advance truth claims. The whole notion of an argument assumes that there is some claims about which there can be truth value, right? That there are some claims that can be true. This is one of them, and here's why it's true, right? We have to make those assumptions, or else we would not be making arguments, all right? Argument is only compatible in a world, in a setting in which there are certain claims that can be true, certain claims that therefore can also be false, right? Okay, there has to be at least some shared assumptions, some stasis, right, on what counts as evidence. We have to have some agreement. This is evidence. This is not evidence, okay? If I'm going to make an argument about human nature, you might say, okay, I'll buy the psychology textbook, but I'm not buying that episode of Scooby-Doo, right? There's evidence and there is not evidence. How do we qualify sources of evidence? What makes good evidence? What makes less good evidence? What makes fantastical, unacceptable evidence? And finally, what are our standards of proof? We're all familiar with the courtroom, right? Okay, that beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, that's in a criminal court. In a civil court, they use preponderance of evidence. That's also what J-Board or University Conduct Board hearings use, is preponderance of evidence, more than 50%. A grand jury would have an even lower standard of evidence, though, right? They only need to have reasonable belief that a crime has been committed, right? That's all they need, a reasonable belief. So not even 51% of the evidence, just a reasonable belief. One of the lowest possible standards, I think, that you could possibly put forward in an argument, right? These are all part of the assumptions that arguers make. They don't always talk about them. In fact, that's part of the problem. Okay, when people enter into arguments, they make assumptions, but assumptions are by their very nature unspoken or taken for granted, right? Okay, you're looking around in an argument text and asking yourself, okay, so what's not here? But that's important. Absence, as some of us like to say, absence is presence. So it's not just that it's not there, but that it is missing. That it should be there in order for the argument to be complete, that the arguer is assuming that it is there. So we should bear in mind that one of the things that makes arguers different from, say, rhetors or persuaders, and that when we're engaging in especially meaningful, intentional, deliberate, reflexive argumentation that demonstrates that we know argumentation theory, right? When we're doing that, we're going to make as few assumptions as possible, and we're going to be really explicit about where we're making assumptions and how we're making assumptions, all right? We're going to say things, the more intentional we are, the better we are, the more we're going to say things like, okay, so I'm assuming standards of proof such as, right, or the reason this evidence is valid in this context is because, right, like those kinds of things we're going to be really explicit about when we make arguments, because we are in an upper level course in argumentation theory, right? We're becoming experts in argument, and that's how experts would frame or put together their arguments. But most people are not going to do that, right? Most people are not going to do that. And so there's going to be a lot of things that we encounter, and we're going to say, okay, there's a lot of assumptions here, but all things considered, this is a good argument, right? We're not necessarily ever going to encounter an argument where every little assumption is made clear and explicit. We're going to encounter really good arguments that make really big assumptions sometimes that it would be better if they unpacked. But hey, what we get to do, right, is we get to play detective. So we have a text and we're looking for what is not there, what is missing, what is assumed. So we're going to read the text and we're going to look for clues, right? Just like when you were in preschool and you played Blue's Clues, right? Now, we're going to use as an example to kind of walk you through this. We're going to use that You Guys reading that was in last week's discussion. And so the more familiar you are with this reading, the more this is going to make sense. I'm going to give you a quick word of advice here on doing this kind of analysis. read the whole article or text or case study first, and then go back and start processing it along the lines of, like, what do we know as a theory, right? Ask yourself these kind of questions, right? Read the piece and then sit down and say, okay, what do I know? Who is the arguer? Right? Do I know anything about the interlocutors? Is the interlocutor present in any way in the piece? Or rather, maybe, how is the interlocutor present in the piece? And I'm going to ask myself, who is the audience, right? Not who am I necessarily, but who is this arguer-interlocutor relationship? Who are they arguing in front of? Who is the jury? Who is the audience who will adjudicate this argument? Not necessarily am I part of that audience. I do have to be conscious of the fact that I may not be, right? Okay, so the arguer is Janaea Desmond Harris, right? I'm not quite sure if that's how you say the name, but okay, Ms. Desmond Harris, that's going to be our arguer. That is the person making the argument. We could, if we wanted to be a little bit more broad here, we could maybe make the claim that this is Vox magazine as an entity, right? And that Ms. Desmond Harris is merely kind of the focal point of that entity here. You could make some arguments here, but you could make some interpretations, but I think it's fairly safe to start with the assumption, at least, that this is an argument by Miss Janaea Desmond Harris, right? All right. Who is the interlocutor? Now here, okay, Ms. Desmond Harris is a little vague, okay? And Desmond Harris also is something that we're going to call later not super charitable in her descriptions of the interlocutor, right? The interlocutor in this case are people who don't believe in equality and people who are lazy, okay? That seems to be sort of her opposition, and that's probably not a great way to characterize one's opponent if one is arguing from a position of reason. Who is the audience? A lot of times I don't expect this, but if I'm doing something and it's for points, I'm a go-getter. I'm going to pull out the supercomputer connected to the world of information that I carry around in my pocket with me everywhere I go. I'm going to pull that out and I'm going to Google Vox magazine. And this is what I get, right? I went to Wikipedia and I just learned some stuff. Okay, it was founded by people who started at the Washington Post. They consider themselves to be contextual information providers, so they give context and background on stories in the news, and their audience, the people that they reach out to, the people that they market their advertising to, are educated households with six-figure incomes and a head of household who is less than 35 years old, right? So they are talking about young, probably white collar, because we're talking about educated and that upper middle class income sort of professional households. So I know a lot about this already. And I got to tell you something. If I were to ask you to describe that argument, and I did, if I were to ask you to describe that argument and you were to say, okay, here's what I know about this argument. The arguer is named Desmond Harris. The interlocutor is not treated super kindly, but they are people who don't think that this whole thing is a big deal, either because they're lazy or they don't care about equality. And the audience is educated professionals with an upper middle class income who are relatively young, right? Okay, and I can walk through some of these assumptions. And the idea here, I'm playing detective. I'm making some guesses. I'm Googling some stuff. I'm figuring some stuff out. I'm filling in sort of the blanks. But the important thing here is that I start drawing some implications in terms of what that means for arguments. So when I start describing arguments, to simply say, here is the arguer, here's the interlocutor, here is the audience, and I'm done, I've already done more descriptively than simply summarizing the argument and repeating back to us what Desmond Harris already wrote, right? Okay, what you're doing when you summarize is you're giving us less than what Desmond Harris gave us, right? Okay, when you describe, you're telling us more than is in the article. You're saying, okay, let's classify and start arranging and naming the stuff that's going on here, the text in front of us. So just doing that is descriptively better, more complex, more theoretically sophisticated, just that, than repeating back the Cliff Notes version of the original article. Once we start learning theory, once we start learning theory words, we can use those words as a kind of like magnifying glass to continue our detective work, right? So we know that arguers make assumptions about arguments. So let's go looking for those kind of things. We know some stuff about the context. We're putting together a picture of the setting, okay? We know this is a blog or an online magazine. So, and part of the idea of providing a lot of background and a lot of context on news stories, the stuff that Vox says it does for its readers, we would expect to find in that piece links to sources, clarifying materials, where I can go to learn more, like avenues to give readers more depth, right? That kind of like maybe intellectual clickbait located throughout the article. That is something I'm going to expect to see when I read this. But I'm probably not going to get the same kind of things that I would get if I were looking at an online journal, for example. I'm not going to get detailed like page number in-text citations. I'm not going to get a really thick anthology at the end. Like I might get a couple of articles, maybe, but I'm going to expect to find those up in the click links up above, the blue highlighted stuff. I'm not really going to anticipate that I'm going to see a bibliography here. And so the fact that it doesn't have a bibliography, the fact that it doesn't have formal in-text citations, I'm not going to really hold that as a kind of major negative here, because like no blogger, no online magazine really does that. At the same time too, Vox says, listen, we are a reproducer of news. I'm not going to expect to see a lot of original interviews. I'm going to see a lot of them cutting and pasting from blogs or from articles, right? I'm going to expect them to go to experts, to go to authorities, to go out and see where witnesses have put their information out there in other contexts, in other publication formats, and they're going to bring that back, right? So I expect to see them quoting the New York Times, not doing the kind of like investigative reporting that the New York Times does. Again, that's something that I would expect to see on a news blog that is a sort of reproducer of news. And last but not least, because of that context, I'm not expecting like jury court criminal trial level of proof here. In fact, a blog, I'm expecting really kind of the lowest level of proof, closer to like what we would expect in a grand jury. Because what they're just trying to get me to do is kind of be like, there's a reasonable case to be made here. Maybe it's something for you to think about, right? Kind of food for thought level of proof, rather than, oh, you got me, I'm going to change my life based on this article. Now, I think it's reasonable to maybe move it up closer to that preponderance of evidence standard. I don't think that's entirely unreasonable for us to do as we kind of go through there. The person is making an argument. They do want me to change my behavior. They are speaking broadly to a lot of people in a kind of influential way. So we can have a little bit of range in there. But certainly we're not going to put it up at the level of, say, court of law. We're certainly not going to put it in the same category as getting a scientific theory published in a leading journal, for example, right? We're nowhere near that kind of standard of proof, and we shouldn't try to hold it to that assumption. Assumption about the world, right? Like we could go on and on forever, right? Like this is a person who believes that offices exist. This is a person who believes that teams are real. Okay, yeah. There's a lot of that really kind of obvious, intuitive, sort of a very literal kind of stuff here that we could talk about. But I think also there are some important assumptions about what's good and not good that the arguer's making. And if you don't share those assumptions, this argument is going to be really, really wildly completely uncompelling, but for all the wrong reasons. Not because she's wrong, but because you don't share those same assumptions about what's good and not good, right? She is very, very clear that for her, she believes that equality is good, sexism and discrimination are not good, right? And that these are real, not just that they're there, but that these are real high in the good bad pantheon, right? Okay, like not bad like undersalting food bad, right? Like bad like KKK burning crosses, lynching people bad, right? Like way more down the bad scale. And at the same time, equality isn't something that we should strive for. It's something that is really, really super important. And she doesn't just make those assumptions. Those are assumptions that when you read the article, she assumes her readers are making too, and that they also rank those values in very similar ways. I think there's also a really important assumption, and this is a little bit more developed, like there are maybe a couple of sentences here, but I don't really see them so much as arguments as kind of like clarifiers of an assumption, bringing forward and saying, remember folks, this is true, and that is that if we can change the way people think, then we can change the way people act, right? And the way that we change then the way people think and act is by changing the way people speak. If we influence and limit or expand the range of words people use, that will influence their behavior, the way they act and behave in the real world. Speaking change influences thought change. Thought change brings about that kind of sort of more material, literal kind of change. And that assumption is built in. It's an assumption that she's going to share, for example, with Orwell, right? Okay, in 1984, they were saying we're going to change the way people speak, and therefore we're going to change the way they think in order to control them and keep them from overthrowing the state. Okay, so a kind of like ugly, dark side, devil-y kind of thought control, whereas Desmond Harris is arguing from the perspective of we're going to change the way people speak because the way people speak influences the way people think and behave, and that changes the world that we live in to the positive or the negative, right? Okay, that we're trying to move it to a more positive world by changing. That's going to be her argument. They both share this assumption, perhaps many of you do too, okay, that changing language changes thought, changing thought changes the world. So, remember that understanding a context, right? Okay, that this was published in 2015, that it was published online, who the arguer is, etc. Those sorts of factors help us interpret texts, okay? Like that's good to kind of get a sense of where the text sits and to contextualize it in order to understand it better. But to say you understand a text, at least in part means that you're able to say, here are some of the relevant assumptions that this arguer is making and that this arguer assumes that I am also making. These are things that the arguer assumes that I share. Okay, it means we can talk about and break those down in terms of assumptions about the world and assumptions about arguments. And last but not least, all right, that means that we're starting to describe the setting of the argument, okay? The setting of the argument. We've moved from sort of reading it and saying, I can repeat back what I read, and now we're moving to a stage where we're able to say, okay, here's something meaningful about what I just read, something that somebody who gets arguments on a theoretical kind of level could say, that someone who doesn't get arguments on a theoretical level wouldn't necessarily be able to say. So I hope that helps you make sense of that. I hope that the examples are working for you, and we're going to be doing a lot more of this. So buckle up.